Hello, everybody. This should be working now. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on your location. I'm Eugenio Refini, a faculty member in the Department of Italian Studies at NYU. Welcome, everybody, to the second event of Viva Voce, which is a new series of interdisciplinary conversations on voice, performance, and reception, hosted by the Department of Italian Studies and Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò at NYU, which I wish to thank for the enthusiastic support they have given to this project. And a special round of virtual applause goes to our tech-savvy Julian Zaks, who's handling the webinar. So thank you, Julian. Today, I also would like to acknowledge the generous support of NYU's Medieval and Renaissance Center, which is co-sponsoring this event. So today's bill, which is truly transatlantic in that it brings together two wonderful scholars based in New York and Cape Town, addresses a fascinating and timely topic that has been long time overlooked, early modern voice and the representation of racial difference. Honestly, I cannot think of a better pair of scholars to tackle the complex cluster of questions raised by this topic. In the interest of time, I will keep my introductions short so as to get started as quickly as possible. So our presenter, our speaker today is Dr. Emily Wilburn, who is an associate professor of musicology at CUNY, Queen's College, and the Graduate Center. She specializes in Italian theatrical music and sound during the 17th century, and in questions of embodiment, performance, race, gender, and sexuality. Among her many publications, I will mention just two, that illustrate Dr. Wilburn's wide-ranging and original approach to the study of early modern music and theater, an approach that has shed light on the crucial, though ephemeral and not easy to conceptualize, role of sound in theatrical experiences as diverse as early modern drama, spoken drama, and early opera. So in this respect, her monograph, 17th Century Opera and the Sound of the Commedia dell'arte, University of Chicago Press, 2016, is a milestone. Now, in 2011, Dr. Wilburn was awarded the Phillip Prize for Excellence in Queer Music Scholarship for her article, Amor nello specchio, 1622, Mirroring Masturbation and Sex and Same-Sex Love, which is also another excellent reading. Now, cherry picking from her other achievements and awards, I'm happy to recall that she was a fellow at the Harvard University Center for Renaissance Studies at Villa I Tatti in 2017-2018, because that is, I believe, the place where we first met. Since 2017, Dr. Wilburn has been editor-in-chief of Women and Music. As a respondent to the lecture, I am delighted to introduce another great scholar whom I admire very much, Dr. Janie, who is an associate lecturer at the University of Cape Town's South African College of Music, as well as research officer for East Africa on the Mellon-funded project Recentering Afro-Asia, Musical and Human Migrations in the Pre-Colonial Period, 700 to 1500. The multifold nature of her research interests make her the ideal respondent for today's talk, I believe. On the one hand, Dr. Cole is also a specialist of Italian music, poetry, and theater in the late Renaissance and the Baroque, and her two monumental monographs are well known to scholars in the field: A Muse of Music in Early Baroque Florence, the poetry of Michelangelo Buonarroti il Giovane, and Music, Spectacle, and Cultural Brokerage in Early Modern Italy, both published in Florence with Olszki, 2007 and 2011. On the other hand, she's also a specialist of 20th century South African music, protest and prisoner resistance during the anti-apartheid struggle, the musical culture in the Christian Kingdom of Ethiopia, and transcultural encounters with Latin Europe and the early modern Indian Ocean world. Among her innumerable awards and prizes, I'll just recall, even in this case, that Janie was also a fellow at Villa Itati. And a particular kudos to Dr. Cole for her role as the founding disciplinary representative in Africana studies for the Renaissance Society of America. So I would like to welcome Emily and Janie. Thanks very much for being here today. And I will hand it over to Emily, whose presentation is entitled Early Modern Voice and the Representation of Racial Difference, Scenes of Performance at the Medici Court in the Primo Seicento. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Eugenio. It is a real pleasure to be here, whatever here is, in this virtual space. I do have a PowerPoint that I'm trying to share. Is that working? Can you see it? Yes.
Yes, it is.
Yes, great. Excellent. So this talk comes from a longer project in two senses. I'm working on a book, but very shortly with Saggiatore Musicale, an article is going to be published that talks about 3 different instances. And I kind of went back and forth trying to make this talk about whether I should give a really condensed version of all 3 or just talk in depth about one. And I went for the second of those. So I hope that it still makes sense without the other 2, but it seemed like it was becoming too superficial when I tried to do otherwise. So here goes. In France, on October 25th, 1608, the 4th intermedio to the judgment of Paris at a spectacular staging of Florentine authority over the new, depicting Amerigo Vespucci in the moment of his arrival on American soil. The performance was part of celebrations for the wedding of Cosimo de' Medici, heir of the then Grand Duke Ferdinando de' Medici, to Maria Magdalena of Austria, daughter of the Austrian Archduke Charles II, and sister to Queen Margaret of Spain, who was in turn married to King Philip III. The text of the Intermedio, noted as the first historical subject of the early modern stage, was written by Giovan Battista Strozzi il Giovane, who had labored over an epic poem about the explorer some years previously, and the topic itself was considered relevant not only because of the bride's connection to America, as Leah Markey points out. Ironically, or perhaps fittingly, Maria Maddalena's dowry was paid with gold from the fleets from the Indies, but also because less than 2 months previously, the Florentines had launched a secret and technically illegal expedition to scout the mouth of the Amazon in search of gold, Brazil wood, and land. The reenactment of Vespucci's arrival in America foregrounded Florentine symbols on his boat and body. The scene became a placid and quiet sea, and the shore appeared covered with trees of a kind unknown to us, and here and there among them were seen houses made of palms and reeds, some on the ground, others in the trees, the air full of parrots and similar varieties of birds, and on the ground, naked men dressed as in the West Indies. On this ocean, a large sailboat appeared with a lion on the prow and lilies over the mast, and among the sails, by these signs, one could recognize Amerigo Vespucci, Fiorentino, who sat armed on the poop deck with an overcoat in the style of his country and an astrolabe in hand. As the scene continued, the Florentine slant was further heightened, with choral singing provided by the European sailors and by a chorus of heavenly visitors, including 10 poets from various centuries and of various nationalities, each distinguished by their clothing and respective crown, not least among them Dante and Petrarch, and all together admiring the achievements of the Florentine captain, they began to sing. The Native Americans, on the other hand, remained silent. And indeed, as a means to hear the voices of foreign others, the intermedio fails. The uomini nudi, described by Camillo Rinuccini in the description above, are absent from the extant sketch of the stage design by Giulio Parigi and from the widely circulated Cantagallina print derived from it, which is what I've put up here. Despite, or perhaps because, of the ethnographic visuality of plant life, buildings, and sleeping arrangements, articulated here as palms, huts, and hammocks, the soundscape of the Americas is relegated to irrelevance, inaudible under the choirs of European sailors and European poets. As such, this performance rehearses an association of early modern racial difference as costume, a masquerade to delight the eyes with little relationship to an actual racial or ethnic other. At the same time, this absence of ethnographic sound reinscribes the metaphorical valence of the voice within liberal democracy. The Indigenous Americans in this scene have not been heard, they have not been given a voice. If they had, their presence as people, as subjects, would be more palpable to modern audiences and harder to ignore. The decorative visuality of foreign representation within early modern European theatre has functioned as limit and justification for the paucity of musicological work on early modern racial difference. Ralph P. Locke, introducing his work on musical exoticism from 1500 to 1800, notes that the awareness of non-Western musics will be treated only briefly in the present book because published descriptions and transcriptions of, say, Chinese music had little or no echo in Western musical works that evoked the respective land or people. Owen Wright, discussing early modern Turqueries, emphasizes that, however realistic the costumes may have been, there is nothing authentically Turkish in the music. Wendy Heller, summarizing the literature, concludes it would be some time before the sounds of Asia or the Americas were absorbed by composers. In this presentation, and even more so in the longer article from which it is drawn, I trouble such logic on three fronts. First, by examining the co-presence of non-Florentine bodies in Florence, and thus the deep familiarity of Florentines with foreignness of various stripes. Second, by listening for the ways in which musical sounds narrated foreignness within Florentine theatrical spectacle. And third, by questioning the voice as a transparent marker of agency and subjectivity. Anthropologist Amanda Weidman has argued that in modernity, voice is a crucial site of knowledge. In her words, both a set of sonic, material, and literary practices shaped by culturally and historically specific moments, and a category invoked in discourse about personal agency and political power. These dense and deeply ingrained associations can trip us up, coding silence as epistemological absence. Not coincidentally from my interest in the city, in histories of sound during this period, Florence looms large, lionized as the birthplace of the fully musical theatrical form known as opera. The radical novelty of opera resided in recitative, a responsive text setting for the solo voice designed to imitate in music the flexible rhythms and declamatory impact of the spoken word. Freed from formal repetitions and metrical regularity, the music of recitative could respond to and embody each word, phrase, or emotion. Such music was intrinsically dramatic, and indeed, the success of early opera lay not merely in the use of music to accompany drama, but in the widely held conviction that musical sound could itself narrate the theatrical work more effectively than words alone. In the voice, in Florence, in the years around 1600, both the literal and metaphorical senses of Weidman's definition cohered so effectively that the recognizably modern subjectivity represented in the stile rappresentativo assumes a naturalized expressivity. Thus, alongside the semantic content of the libretto, the voice of each character was assumed to reveal their gender, age, occupation, social status, and emotional sincerity. In the longer version of this paper, I consider three scenes of performance in Florence in which racial or ethnic representation, sonic signification, and subjectivity complicate the presumed absence of race from European musics of the time. These include the 1613 performance of Francesca Caccini's Balletto della Cortesia, in which a boatload of Syrian refugees washes up in Livorno, staged shortly after the arrival of the Drusian emir Fakhardin and his entourage, themselves Syrian refugees, as well as the songs of Giovanni, an enslaved Black child who was gifted to the Grand Duchess sometime before 1610, at which date he petitioned for baptism. Today, I have time for only one such scene, and I have chosen to focus on Indigenous Americans and South Asian populations, both described as indiani in contemporary sources. The horse ballet, Guerra d'Amore, performed in 1616, and the Corso degli Indiani, a summer palio staged that same year, provide a fascinating record of sonic and visual Indians. Both confound the East and West Indies, or real and imagined Indians, in ways that militate against claims of ethnographic authenticity. Yet through sound, both reveal clearer conceptions of racial difference than modern analyses typically allow. By 1616, the ambitious Southern Hemispheric plans hatched under Ferdinando I and referenced in the intermedio with which I begin were largely put aside, but the knowledge acquired about the Indies persisted, as evidence of the 1608 Brazilian expedition makes clear. As early as 1591, Ferdinando was actively collecting information on the region of Brazil and the prospect for trade. Throughout the early 1600s, several attempts were made to import sugar directly from the New World to Livorno, where the Medici planned to build a sugar refinery. And in 1608, even as the expedition was launched, Ferdinando made diplomatic inquiries at the court of Phillip III about purchasing a portion of the Brazilian coast as a dominion for one of his younger sons. When this came to no avail, he engaged in similar discussions with several Portuguese citizens regarding parts of what is now Sierra Leone. The Brazilian exploratory expedition financed by Ferdinando demonstrates the depth of his interest in the monetary and territorial benefits of colonial expansion and global trade, as well as his conception of the political power of Florence vis-à-vis other foreign powers. The voyage was captained by Robert Thornton, an English sailor, and was based on detailed maps and instructions provided by the English cartographer and explorer Robert Dudley, an illegitimate son of the Earl of Leicester. Dudley converted to Catholicism in the early years of the 17th century and moved to Florence in 1606, entering the service of the Grand Duke. In a previous voyage of 1594-5, Dudley had traveled to Trinidad, the mouth of the Orinoco, and Puerto Rico. Dudley later published a report on the 1608 Thornton voyage in his Arcano del Mare, printed in Italian in 1646 and 61. Further details about the 1608 expedition are provided by the ship's surgeon, the Protestant Englishman William Davies, in A True Relation of the Travails and Most Miserable Captivity, in which Davies also elaborates on the 8 years and 10 months he spent enslaved under the Florentine Grand Duke, first in hard labor in Livorno, transporting building materials for the port city's continued expansion, and then as a galley slave at Ore. According to Davies, Ferdinando furnished Thornton with a good ship called the Santa Lucia, with a frigate and a tartana, and both other types of ships, well victualled and well manned, and chiefly bound to the river of Amazons, with other several rivers, the which the Duke would have inhabited, hoping for great store of gain of gold, but the countries did afford no such thing. Thornton and his party left Livorno on September the 8th, 1608, arriving safely at the mouth of the Amazon, then following the coast westward as far as the island of Trinidad. They arrived back in Livorno on July the 10th, 1609, with a crew of 47 plus 6 indiani, in Dudley's words. Furthermore, Thornton discovered the good port of Cayenne, which is a well-defended and secure port and which had not previously been well explored by Christians. And from here, he took with him 5 or 6 Indians to present to their highnesses in Florence, which he did. They were of those Caribi who eat human flesh. They then died in Florence, most of them of smallpox, which to them is more infectious than the plague itself, because in their countries they have no sign of such illness. Just one of them survived and went on to serve the most serene Prince Cardinal de' Medici at court for several years and learned to speak the Italian language comfortably well. The indigenous American who survived was initially called Matteo, then later Giovanni. His service at the Medici court emphasizes the presence of foreigners, as does William Davies's years in the slave bagno in Livorno and the presence of numerous English sailors and scientists at the court. Some further details of Matteo Giovanni and his compatriots emerges in a newly discovered document filed by Francesco Carletti in support of Matteo's petition for baptism. Carletti's account, written in 1611, complicates slightly the exact location of where Matteo Giovanni boarded Thornton's ship, adds the detail that the choice to do so was voluntary, this Carletti repeats for good measure, and resolves the question of whether 5 or 6 indiani were involved. Notably, Carletti is himself famous as the first private citizen to circumnavigate the globe. His account of his travels through the Indie Orientali and Indie Occidentali were originally delivered as an oral presentation in installments before the Grand Duke and circulated in contemporary manuscripts. Carletti entered Ferdinando's service in 1606. I, Francesco Carletti, Maestro di Casa to His Highness, certify that, in the month of July 1609, I was commanded by His Highness to arrange the way for 5 Indians who had come from the West Indies. These men had been brought to Tuscany by the English captain Thornton, in the number of 6, but one was sick in the hospital where he died. And having spoken many times with the aforementioned captain, who told me that he had brought them at their own volition from the banks of the Amazon River and from other places along the coast of the aforementioned Indies, places full of heathens, where he, Thornton, had gone the year before with a boat, and he said that there was not a single Christian there. Furthermore, he attested that they were a very simple, uncivilized people, as one could well believe from their having voluntarily come to this country without knowing where they were going. And having all arrived here, we see that among these Indians there was one who was called Matteo by the aforementioned captain, who, all his other companions having died, wants to become a Christian. Under orders from His Highness, he was regularly sent to San Giovannino, where he was instructed and indoctrinated by Father Claudio Seripani, who gives his word that the aforementioned Indian is sufficiently instructed so as to be able to receive holy baptism, and this all being true, I have underwritten the present text on the 2nd day of January, 1610, which is, of course, 1611. Despite Carletti's insistence that Matteo Giovanni came to Italy voluntarily, the record of his baptism identifies him as a stiavo del Granduca, emphasizing that the nuances of personal freedom and voluntary versus involuntary service were directly related to perceived racialized differences. This little record that comes from the accounts at the baptistry reads, Giovanni, it's the new baptismal name that he was given, Indian slave of the Grand Duke, about 22 years old, baptized on the given day, which is February 28, 1611. Godfather, the Cavaliere Fabrizio Coloretto. Godmother, Lady Nanina, daughter of the Marchese del Monte at Sansovino. Whether enslaved or in service, Matteo Giovanni's experience at the court would have been dramatically different from the hard labor endured by Davies during his enslavement. Furthermore, as a living, breathing, and Italian-speaking source on the Americas, we should not discount the force of Matteo Giovanni's first-hand testimony. Echoes of his voice can be heard in Dudley's account. This Indian from Cayenne frequently recounted to the author and to others the fertility and wealth of the Kingdom of Guinea, and how he had been to the famous city of El Dorado, capital of the realm, where resided their king, whom they called emperor because he has many realms under his command. And he recounted that the city was rich in gold and situated near a large lake, and that this city was 8 days away from the port of Cayenne, given that the Indians walk very quickly by foot and typically cover 50 miles a day and sometimes more. The aforementioned Indian also said that close to Cayenne, a hilly country, there was a quite rich silver mine that they called Perota, and also of low gold, which they called Calcuri, with which they make certain images and half moons for ornament. The idea that Matteo Giovanni could be heard spesse volte relating tales and details of his home country adds an ethnographic specificity to Florentine knowledge of the New World, even as he is heard to confirm fantastical elements of the American geography, namely the existence of El Dorado. The 2 maps Dudley provides of Matteo Giovanni's home territory, numbers 13 and 14, which I'll show in a minute, are the only 2 to include ethnographically detailed decorative drawings. In part, we can assume because of their dedication to his Medici patrons, but also perhaps because of Dudley's particular and personal experience in the region and his frequent discussions with Matteo Giovanni. Along with the name of each river and inlet and soundings of the water depth off the coast, Dudley provides a precise accounting of the various tribes and nations who were resident in each segment of the coastline. So it says here, Questi sono I nomi delle genti che abitano I fiumi della costa di Guayana. So these are the names of the people, and he's naming all of them. Dudley also provides a list of common Indigenous words and their translations to aid travellers who might wish to converse with native peoples. Dudley's images, and this is just a detail of that second map, brings us back to the question of costumes and thus of performance, for his Native Americans can be fruitfully compared with surviving images from the 1616 production of Guerra d'Amore. The horse ballet was staged on a large scale in Piazza Santa Croce, with the text by Andrea Salvadori, music by Jacopo Peri, Paolo Grazzi, Giobattista Signorini, and Giovanni del Turco, choreography by Agnolo Ricci, and sets, costumes, and machines by Giulio Parigi. The performing forces, including 2 rival armies, 1 Asian, 1 African, with as many as 164 soldiers apiece. The Indians in this scenario were textually Asiatic. The cast includes Indamoro, Re di Narsinga, which is a region in India, played by the Grand Duke himself, as well as 32 sacerdoti brahmani, so Brahmin priests, tanto famosi nell'Oriente, and a host of textual and iconographical allusions make reference to Asian landmarks, such as the Ganges River. Yet Parigi's extant sketch of an Indian warrior, repeated in Jacques Callot's prints of the festivities, make it clear that the Florentines associated a specifically American set of visual influences with the term Indian. While this conflation of East and the West Indies is a geographical mistake, I'm less interested in critiquing such errors than in thinking about the ways in which they signify. The arrival of each army was signaled by the sounds of trumpets, of drums, and of other barbarous instruments. While some fragments of the music used for the 1616 performance survive, the material played by the trumpets, drums, and other barbarous instruments does not, nor should we be surprised. Music for such instruments was rarely notated. The position of court or city trumpeter was largely inherited, and the ensemble served a primarily civic function. Trumpeters and drummers are listed separately from musicians on court rolls from the period. Much of their music was learned by rote or improvised, and by early modern standards may not have counted as music at all, being largely decorative, ceremonial, or militaristic. This does not mean, of course, that such instrumentalists were unable to produce music or sounds inspired by the military traditions of other places. Indeed, the frequency with which enslaved Black laborers and servants were trained as trumpeters and or drummers suggests that an invocation of racially marked music might have been part of the point. Sonic associations of foreignness arise even more strongly in the Palio held on August 12th later that same year on a scenario attributed to Parigi. The text, preserved in a broadsheet, describes a foot race of indiani senza testa, one of 3 groups accompanying the sun, fame, summer, and the hours in a procession that included both music and dance. These Indians, who were born without heads, have their eyes, mouth, and nose in their chest, armed with bows and arrows, and playing nakas and other instruments, according to the usage of their lands, make a delightful show of themselves. The other groups of performers included a host of peasants and shepherdesses playing flutes, whistles, and similar rustic instruments, and a long line of corpulent men with smiling faces, some of whom displayed precious foodstuffs, and others held in their hands various kitchen implements in imitation of musical instruments, and the most noble played and sang, making a ridiculous and noisy harmony, una ridicolosa e strepitosa armonia. In addition, the sun himself, seated on his float, held a golden cetra and sang the praises of the Tuscan realms, and printed verses imply that fame too sang. Again, an explicit geographical origin for the Indians in this parade is far from clear, since they combine the headless aspect of Pliny's blemis with the bows and arrows of Native American populations, and they play instruments associated with the Middle East. The word used is nakare, which comes from the Persian word naka, or the Arabic nakara, meaning drum. The corpulent men, for what it's worth, are described as coming from Cucagna, an imaginary place renowned as the land of plenty since the late medieval period, and the rustic peasants were presumably Tuscan. What is important here, though, is that each of these groups played music that was different in instrumentation, style, and affect. and particularly that these Indians played their instruments all'usanza dei paesi loro. This music is not notated and does not survive, but the description differentiates between the way music is typically played in Florence and the way it is played by these musicians in this performance in imitation of the way it is played elsewhere. The same phrase, all'usanza dei paesi loro, appears repeatedly in travel writing, for example in Pietre della Valle's viaggi descritti da lui medesimo in lettere familiari, which was nominally written at precisely the same period, though it didn't appear in print for several years. He writes, for example, in a description of Persia. In the presence of the king and of all the bystanders, the young women did several dances according to their usage, all'usanza loro, to the sound of the cerchio, or as they say, narrate, which they carry with them, similar to that of young Roman girls in the month of May, but larger and more sonorous, with which they combined also the sound of the cetri. I'm not sure whether they are of wood or ebony, or wood of ebony or bones of ivory, or of other similarly hard materials, long enough, here called chiahapara, which means 4 pieces, of which they hold 2 of them in each hand, and banging them together in time to the music, they make an indescribable musical noise, uno so che di ronzo musicale. This Persian ronzo musicale is both like and not like practices in Rome. In Della Valle's description and Parigi's scenario, we hear musical noises, una ridicolosa e strepitosa armonia, used in ways that delineate different categories of people. In the corso degli indiani senza testa, 3 different groups of individuals played 3 different types of instruments. The indiani, naccara e altri strumenti all'usanza dei paesi loro, so drums and other instruments. The peasants suonando flauti, sordine e simili rusticali strumenti, and the corpulent men of Cucagna, vari strumenti di cucina che imitando gli strumenti musicali. We can imagine lutes or guitars disguised as ladles or saucepans, as well as percussive instruments of many types. These musics take place in the noisy arena of piazza and street, and step away from the subtle inflections of recitative and the nuova musica in favor of strophic verses, improvised accompaniments, and boisterous percussion. Yet importantly, this unruly soundscape narrates in precisely the way that operatic music is presumed to, testifying to the recognizable coherence of sonic categories, and, through timbre, meter, and sound itself, testifying to the geopolitical origins of the characters concerned. Within the sonic sociability of early opera, street songs and other popularesque musics were indexed to the comic and to the servile, inflecting the foreign bodies of the corso degli indiani in crucial ways. Class and function emerge as key components of representational sonicity. These performances were available for consumption by larger numbers of people and a much larger cross-section of Florentine society than were the early operas, which took place in the Sala della Commedia of the Pitti Palace. In Santa Croce, the Guerra d'Amore was reputedly witnessed by an immensa moltitudine di popolo, and later that evening the participants paraded through the streets in order to entertain the entire city. Indeed, these characters are entertaining. They narrate no internal subjectivity with which the noble listener is expected to identify, but rather represent a chaotic, noisy world of difference within which the subject, him or herself, enjoys the dilettosa mostra. It is notable that several of the actual foreigners I have invoked were enslaved, including both the Indiano Matteo Giovanni and William Davies, the English surgeon who was freed from the bagno in Livorno on the condition that he serve on the Brazilian expedition. Their presence in this narrative highlights the long-established practice of the Mediterranean slave trade facilitated in Tuscany by the development of the Port of Livorno, and of a more exotic trade in singular individuals who turned up at court. To this number, besides Matteo Giovanni, we can add Antonio Correa, reputedly the first Korean to travel within Italy, who arrived in Florence in the service of Francesco Carletti. It is also worth mentioning that the first step of Carletti's long journey around the world was a trip to Capo Verde to load a cargo of Africans enslaved and bound for the New World. The material presence at court of Matteo Giovanni and Antonio Correa in conversation with the world traveler Carletti and the cartographer-explorer Dudley, testifies to a deep understanding of cultural and geographic difference that could and did operate in tandem with less precise invocations of foreign sound. This loose conglomeration of entertaining difference, comic civility, foreign slaves, and popular song calls to mind the famous dictum attributed to Claudio Monteverdi by his brother Giulio Cesare. La sua intenzione è stata, in questo genere di musica, di far che l'orazione sia padrona dell'armonia e non serva. His intention was, in this genre of music, to make the text the mistress of the harmony and not the servant. With such a hierarchy in operation, music itself can be understood as a marker of cultural devaluation, gendered, classed, or raced difference. As scholars, we have developed tools to think about the gendered implications of such ideology, but the very coherence of the category servile still requires our attention. There were certain kinds of music understood as proper to the register of the comic, of servants, and of the enslaved. Such music articulates what Matthew Head has called the relationship between the troping of music as other and Orientalism's construction of otherness. And through it, we can hear the parceling out of full humanity only to certain characters and the association of a natural musical predisposition with the marked bodies of foreign slaves. Ironically, the musical theatre of Italian opera disseminated the ideology of the expressive voice, even as it characterized a hierarchy of persons to whom such a voice was afforded. Too often, scholars listening for race have presumed that the music of foreign others would be easily discernible as itself other, citations or imitations that stick out from an otherwise European texture. Instead, I would argue, markers of musical, cultural, and racial otherness were thoroughly embedded into and integral to the European tradition itself. In listening for the presence of foreign others within European musical sound, we can recognize an inherent slippage between here and elsewhere and discern through auscultation a vocal selfhood that participates in discourses that objectify people as objects in the growing global economy of enslavement and the traffic in material goods. As scholars, we need to denaturalize the expressive voice that cohered so effectively in the new music of Florence around 1600. For its musical and metaphorical success articulated a certain form of modern subjectivity and sound that persists into our present. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. It was a fascinating talk. I'm sure that we will have questions afterwards. Just an anticipation for our attendees, we will have the Q&A option open after Janie calls the response. But thanks really, Emily, for highlighting so many great questions and sort of advancing a series of points which do really give us much food for thought. This idea of, of course, the slippage between here and elsewhere seems particularly timely even in our present circumstances, right? But then more broadly, I think that the point about, sort of reassessing the place of sound and voice within the mechanisms of appropriation of the other, it's such a great question, and as you were saying, something which we haven't really paid enough attention to. So I really look forward to reading more about all these, and I will just at this point hand it over to Janie, call for the response. So I would like to welcome Janie to the floor. Thanks, Janie. I will leave it to you.
Thank you, Eugenio, and thank you for inviting me to respond to this fascinating lecture by Professor Wilburn on the representation of this racial difference in early modern musical theatre sponsored by the Medici family. For one, I am absolutely delighted to finally see musicological work on early modern Italian music, which focuses on race, racial difference, and representation of foreignness in sound, work which is certainly long overdue, and especially when compared to other disciplines in the early modern period. The field of critical race studies in the Renaissance more widely has been gaining steady traction over the last few years, and historians, art historians and theatre historians especially, have long deconstructed these historical assertions, such as the Renaissance being regarded as a purely European phenomenon centered on a largely homogeneous ethnicity and Western in stylistic content. So I'm delighted to see the really interesting questions that are coming out of this new direction of research. And further, the development of early modern opera, the nuova musica, first through composed musical spectacle, has dominated scholarly discourses about music in Florence during the early 1600s. But the question of musical sound as narrating the drama and potentially including racial or ethnic presentation has received really very little attention so far. So Professor Wilburn's talk raises, I think, a number of very interesting questions and themes for discussion. Her primary premise questions the limitations of previous musicologists' works on early modern music and this representation of foreignness or so-called exoticism, which generally dismisses the awareness and presence of any authentic representations of non-Western musics therein, and presumes, therefore, this absence of race in Italian musics. So the question is if and how early modern Italian musics assimilated foreign music, costumes, and people in early modern drama and other musical spectacles. How far were the sounds of Asia or Africa or the Americas, referred often to as this sort of musical exoticism, absorbed by composers in their representations of these foreign lands or people? How far were early modern composers aware of non-Western musics and authentically representing these foreign cultures in their music? And does this lack of representation of a foreign voice in early modern spectacle, indeed, if there is a lack of representation, i.e. a so-called silence, necessarily imply an epistemological absence? So first, Professor Wilburn examines this co-presence of non-Florentine people in Florence and argues that Florentines would have had a deep familiarity with foreignness of various stripes. And I want to come back to this point. Second, she looks at these examples of how musical sounds narrated foreignness within Florentine theatrical spectacle with these specific case studies. And she questions the voice, the early modern voice, as a marker of agency and subjectivity and a crucial site of knowledge. So coming to these case studies specifically, Professor Wilburn focuses on performance scenes of indigenous South Americans and South Asian populations, both described as indiani. These are found in the 1616 horse ballet, the Guerra d'Amore, and the Palio, Corso degli Indiani senza testa, which provide records of sonic and visual Indians. So an important factor to me seems the fact that both works confuse East and West Indies and hence oppose representations of ethnographic authenticity. But Professor Wilburn argues that through sound, both works reveal clearer conceptions of racial difference. So the Guerra d'Amore has two opposing armies, one Asian and one African. I'd very much like to look at the description of the African section of this. Texts by Andrea Salvadori make reference to the setting in Asia, so this Asiatic reference to the Ganges River, Asian landmarks, while Giulio Parigi his sketches of costumes show Indian warriors. These are repeated in Caio's engravings, and these make it clear that Florentines associated a specifically South American set of visuals with the term Indian. So there's this confusion of East and West Indies, and what do they signify? So one of the first questions that came to my mind when looking at these particular case studies was who actually commissioned these works? Often with these theatrical spectacles, the commissioning would come from the Grand Duke, the Grand Duchess, or specific patrons involved in the Medici court context, with letters perhaps being exchanged between court poets and patrons and giving specific instructions on subject matter. And I think the question of patronage in this context is important in terms of the influence that it would have had on the actual content and subject matter of the work. So the point of this confusion is between East and West, and through sound, you've got this clear conceptions of racial difference. But I would actually argue that this type of confusion between the text, Salvadori's text being this setting in Asia, whereas the costumes are most definitely set in the Americas, this type of confusion and lack of coordination between the libretto, set designs, and costumes, I think you can argue was probably quite typical of early modern Italian musical spectacles, where different components were farmed out to various court poets, musicians, singers, and choreographies and artists with little thought to artistic coherency. And we have many precedents of this with even more important works performed on state occasions, where you have a lack of coherence within the overall work performed. Also, these types of spectacles were often prepared in very tight time schedules, especially something like a palio or a horse ballet, which were performed outside for the general public and perhaps considered less important. They would often be performed in a festival occasion or for carnival, and not as important as a state occasion like a Medici court wedding or a visit by an important dignitary to the court, which would have had more preparation time. I think this kind of confusion also with the costumes, specifically, looking at the costumes in the Medici guardaroba, these were often recycled for different performances too, to reduce cost, again, also due to time constraints. So looking at Parigi's sketches, and it might have been well possible, I'm wondering if the 1616 Guerra d'Amore and the Palio were, there's not a lot of time between those two performances. Maybe the costumes were actually used, the same ones used in both performances. Professor Wilburn says that the arrival of each army was signaled by, quote, a sound of trumpets, drums, and other barbarous instruments. And interestingly, fragments of music used in the 1616 performance survive, but not the material played by trumpets, as we would expect, as this type of music was rarely noted, and trumpeters are not listed on court payrolls. But importantly, and I think this is an important point, that trumpeters and drummers could invoke sounds inspired by the military traditions of other places. And indeed, Kate Lowe argues in her work that many enslaved Africans in Italy worked as trades, at trades and occupations that they'd already been trained to do before becoming slaves. And she notes that there are also a large number of Black court musicians. So it would have been quite possible that these types of musicians were already in those musical roles. And drums were certainly indicators of war and military movements in both Africa and India, a point I want to come back to, specifically in relation to the presence of drums in these works. Sonic associations of foreignness arise even more in the Palio, the Corso degli Indiani senza testa. Here the Indians are represented with no heads, and their eyes, mouth, and nose are in their chests. They are armed with bows and arrows, play knackers and other instruments, according to the usage of their lands. Professor Wilburn says the explicit geographical origin for the Indians is not clear. No heads comes from Pliny's blemis, bows and arrows from Native American populations, and they play instruments associated with the Middle East. However, I would argue that it might be possible to be a bit more specific about the geographical origins, which might actually be able to be located in India and Africa. So the Corso degli Indiani being relation to Salvadori's Asiatic setting. So the blemis, we know, well known, first described as inhabitants of ancient Libya or the Nile system, Ethiopia, so Abyssinia from that period. But later traditions actually confined their habitat to a particular island in the Brazone River and then shifted it to India. Writers of antiquity give reports of headless traits in the East Indies. Pliny refers to a tribe of North Africa. Pliny actually situates the blemi somewhere in Ethiopia, Nubia, so in ancient Abyssinia of that period. So I think that there are more direct relations to the Asiatic settings, possibly. The second point, the bows and arrows being from Native American populations, I'm wondering if there could be a relation here to an Indian setting of the Siddhi people in India, who are of African descent, who had bows for hunting, but also played musical bows. So, we know that musical bows are very widespread in southern Africa, but migrated across the Indian Ocean with the Siddhi people in India. So I'm wondering if there could be a connection there rather than to the Native American populations. And then the third point about them playing instruments associated with the Middle East, nakare, from the Persian word nakar or the Arabic nakara, meaning drum. But these instruments may not necessarily have been from the Middle East. Again, Indian and African instruments have these associated terms, nagara and nagarit. The ancient sounds of Ethiopian wars. So again, it's drums associated with war, militaristic settings, which would fit the Salvadori setting for these armies. The ancient sounds of Ethiopian wars were characterized by the pounding nagarit, which accompanied marching troops. Nagarit meaning what announces, the annunciator in Ge'ez, from the verb nagara, to mean to say, make known. And they refer to a pair of drums. They were objects representing power and endowed with royal authority. In this particular Salvadori setting, it's difficult to tell the exact hierarchical position that the Indiani would have occupied. It's unlikely that they would have had royal authority. But these nagarit were not necessarily played. It was more their visual presence on display. It sounds like there was sound in this particular Florentine setting, but there didn't necessarily have to be sound for these drums to be on display. And similar drums referred to as nagara, so it's nakare, nagara, nagarit. Similar drums can be found in Indian traditions from the same period. The role of the Indian kettle drum, nagara, during wartime is described they come up in many oral sources from this period, and as being used during acts of war, and described as being tuned at different tonal ranges. So different armies would tune them at a different range as going against an enemy army. And they would be drumming rhythms against the actual marching troops that they were opposing. So I think there are possibilities here of relating much more clearly the geographical origins, perhaps to India and possibly Africa in this sense. Another important point which emerges, and I think is a really interesting one to consider, is this whole idea of Medici knowledge of other worlds, and in this whole context of the age of exploration. How much would the Medici have known about these foreign lands? So we know that in 1591, Ferdinando I was collecting information about Brazil, the colonial expansion with this prospect of global trade. And we've got this context of the 1608 Medici Brazilian expedition, where they brought back 6 indiani to present to the Grand Dukes. Professor Wilburn argues that the service of this so-called, this person, Matteo Giovanni, at court emphasizes the presence of foreigners at court. But I do wonder how few and far between these particular people, foreigners at court were. It's quite clear that Matteo Giovanni was certainly a great source on the Americas. He spoke Italian. He would have added knowledge, Florentine knowledge of the New World, such as names of local indigenous tribes, local languages, and together with Dudley, the English cartographer and explorer, who provided images and maps of Matteo's homeland, these images can be compared to these images of the, used in the 1616 Guerra d'Amore in costumes and performance. So is this a whole idea of knowledge transfer? How does knowledge become transfer? Is there a direct correlation? But I would question, how much would a few individuals really have impacted much wider court knowledge? Who was the driving force behind the patronage and sponsorship of these spectacles? In fact, under Ferdinando Primo, we have quite substantial knowledge to show that it was Christine of Lorraine who was behind many of the commissions. And how much would the Grand Duchess have known and read up about these foreign lands to oversee these new libretti coming out from Salvadori and scenes from Parigi? And more to the point, how much would early Florentine composers like Jacopo Peri, librettists like Salvadori, and costume and set designers, how much knowledge would they have for creating these foreign characters and settings in sound, words, and visuals? None of them had traveled outside of Europe. How much would they have known about these cultures? Would they have had access, for example, to well-known early modern travel accounts, such as by Ramusio or Pietro della Valle? Ramusio's accounts of his navigazioni were, by this period, very widespread and already come out in several editions. So they would have certainly been accessible to people at the court. But I do question how much this knowledge would have actually transferred to the court musicians and composers. And this brings us on to the very interesting idea of this presence of foreigners in Europe, Italy, and the Medici court as purveyors of knowledge, and this link to slavery. The presence of foreigners like Black Africans, for example, in Europe and Italy is very important to consider, since Africans had such an important influence on European thought and culture, far disproportionate to the size of the small Black population. So, for example, something like 150,000 in the Iberian Peninsula in the 16th century, and by the 18th century, they amounted to just several thousand in France, a few thousand in the Netherlands, and several hundred scattered through Germany, Scandinavia, Russia, and Italy. So we're talking very small numbers overall. The first recorded visitors of Ethiopians to Europe was in Genoa in 1306. It's probably Ethiopian monks making a pilgrimage, or possibly as an embassy. But Genoa itself was central to the slave trade in the 13th century, including Africans. In 1402, we have the first documented Ethiopian embassy to Venice. Up until this point, however, the pre-modern African presence in Europe had mostly comprised uprooted Africans traded as slaves across the Sahara. The 140,000 slaves imported into Europe from Africa between 1450 and 1505, so in this earlier period, were a welcome new labor force in the wake of the bubonic plague. On the whole, Blacks in Christian Iberia were not limited to servile roles, but they were not necessarily influential as a group. And I do wonder if the situation was the same in Italy. Blacks in Spain served as factory workers, farm laborers, footmen, coachmen, and butlers. Male and female domestics apparently lived well compared to other lower class people. And slaves could work in all of the crafts, but they couldn't join the guilds. And the same was, I believe, the same in Florence. Europe received Black Africans regularly in significant numbers from the mid-15th century onwards. So the Mediterranean was this cross-cultural and inter-ethnic space even before classical Greece. But I question how embedded that foreign culture, foreign sound, musics was really in those European traditions by the 1600s. And this link to slavery, this presence of foreign others within European musical sound, points to discourses that objectify people as objects. So they become objects of curiosity, status symbols. So status symbols to own by European courts, gifting Black slaves. So this traffic, they become material goods in a way. And associated with this, I think a very important point that comes out in Professor Wilburn's talk is this idea of the terminology used in these performance descriptions to describe foreigners, and also in travel accounts. So according to the usage of their lands, all'usanza dei paesi loro, in the anonymous description of the 1616 Palio and Pietro della Valle's Viaggi describing this Persian performance. This is a typical phrase that you find in travel accounts of the early modern period. You also find phrases like instrumentos de los terras. I've been looking at accounts of Jesuit missions working in Goa and then traveling across to Ethiopia, and where they're describing indigenous Indian and Ethiopian instruments respectively. And they always come back to this sort of standard phrase of the usage of their lands, the instruments of their lands, to describe indigenous practices. But these descriptions are often very stereotypical and derogatory. Often the description of the actual musical sound is derogatory. Pietro della Valle calls it un non so che di ronzo musicale. So, it's this idea of this musical noise. It's not lyrical. Likewise, Parici's scenario, we hear musical noises, una ridicolosa e strepitosa armonia. So likewise, this is typical of travel accounts. One brings to mind this travel account by Charles Poncet, French traveler to Africa in the mid-1600s. He lived in Gondar in the Ethiopian highlands in the circles close to King Yasu I, and he notes the use of kettle drums in a procession accompanying the king. And he writes, when leaving with ceremony, the king is accompanied by about 2,000 men, cavalry or infantry. The kettle drums, trumpets, flutes, oboes, or instruments unfamiliar to me precede the troops. The accord of all these instruments does not make an agreeable sound. So again, there's this sort of slightly derogatory terminology being used to describe this foreignness. Again, stereotypical images in the opening of Professor Wilburn's paper, Giovanni Battista Strozzi, il Giovane's depiction of the Americas, are stereotypical images with the uomini nudi come costuma nelle Indie occidentali, these naked men dressed, palms, huts, hammocks, these ethnographic elements. And the question of where do these stereotypes concerning Black people and colored people of color, how were they established in this period? Interestingly, Kate Lowe provides several examples relating to the main set of prejudices. The African was generally described as a naked person who would mutilate his or her face and body with scarification, piercings, and tattoos. He or she would be considered as carefree and characterized by immoderate laughter, unaware of his or her condition, lazy and sexually promiscuous, physically strong, a good musician or dancer. And Lowe also recognizes the existence of noble or ennobled Black men in European courts, but she stresses the role of Black people as this sort of necessary counter-image in the construction of European whiteness and civilization. And I wonder if, associated with these depictions in these early modern spectacles, whether there is this sort of want to give this counter-image of these sort of slightly savage and uncivilized others, foreign others, to counteract this construction of civilization, European civilization, and a coin which was obviously later termed in the 18th century. But the denigration of Blacks was also found in underlying notions within European cultures, and images of Blacks and attitudes about Blacks were present in Europe long before there was actually any significant physical presence. So we know that in visual arts, religion, epics, and legends, the Middle Ages provide fascinating array of examples. And there's this sort of persistent pattern of ambivalence in the attitudes of white Europeans toward Blacks that has survived over the centuries. They contain both positive and negative features, but there tends to be a tilt towards the negative. So I'm thinking of Paul Kaplan's work, for example, on the adoration of the Magi, the sort of single most popular religious theme featuring Blacks in European art, where the Black king is handsome, he has noble bearing. He's usually depicted as the youngest, presumably symbolizing what art historians have read as sort of Africa as this continent just beginning to participate in world affairs. So there's this hint of backwardness in a sort of is this sort of negative aspect. I've been working on this 1540 account by a Jesuit chaplain Francisco Alvarez. It's an account of the first documented encounter between Ethiopia and royal European power, the Portuguese in this case. And he describes their meeting with the Ethiopian emperor after 5 years of looking for the fabled Prester John. They finally arrived on Ethiopian soil, and after many attempts to meet the emperor, they finally do. And there's a sort of description of Lebna Degnal as this very young-looking, handsome, but the emphasis on the young, although Lebna Degnal at the time would have been 44 years old. So there does seem to be this hint there again of Africa being behind, and a derogatory slant on that. Professor Wilburn argues that the presence of actual foreigners at court, so enslaved ones like the Indiano Matteo Giovanni and William Davis, the English surgeon, so this combination of long-established Mediterranean slave trade and exotic trade in singular individuals at court, like Antonio Correa, the first Korean, who's in service with Carletti. All these different components testify to a deep understanding of cultural and geographic difference that operated in tandem with these invocations of foreign sound. But I would question this deep understanding and rather suggest that the knowledge was perhaps a more superficial one that was handed down in diluted forms to the court composers and musicians and artists, and hence also explains their mixing up of these different cultural traditions and traits. I also wondered in that respect, looking at other, I know Professor Wilburn has been working on other works which represent aspects of the other, of foreignness, and were there other works performed at the Medici court, perhaps sponsored by subsequent Grand Dukes? Do you get a sense of any change in racial representations as we move through the different reigns of Ferdinando through Cosimo II and then into the 1620s regency under the women? Be interesting to see if there was any kind of development there in perhaps more knowledge or a more in-depth representation of racial representation. I'm just checking the time here. I think my time is probably up. But I just wanted to finish by saying that, this whole idea of who gets a voice, I think, is a really interesting one. Professor Wilburn argues that early Italian operas disseminated this ideology of the expressive voice while establishing a hierarchy of persons to whom such a voice is afforded. But perhaps instead of being a deliberate attempt at racial difference and not affording a voice to foreign bodies, is it not simply because composers and poets did not have the cultural and musical knowledge of these foreign lands to adequately depict them in their musical works? Scholars listing for race have presumed that music of foreign others would be easily recognizable as itself, this other imitations of foreign musics. But perhaps they were more superficial representations of foreignness. And finally, I would say this new line of musicological inquiry, which I think is really exciting, really firmly grounds early modern Italian music in the much wider context of a global Renaissance and global histories of music, along the lines of recent work by David Irving, Olivia Blöckel, and Reinhard Strom. And this much wider perspective excitingly takes us scholars outside the confines of the European Renaissance, European geopolitical context, and solely European itineraries into an interconnected early modern global world. Thank you.
Thank you, Janie, for this fabulous response. And I would invite Emily to get back on stage. And of course, we can begin by just, reacting to the response. And I will just invite also our attendees to drop questions in the Q&A box, if you will. We will be happy to address them. But Emily, I will just...
firstly, just thank you. That was so rich. I don't even know where to start. There's so much in that. So thank you. I would love to get a copy of those. I will say maybe two things. Firstly, when I started doing the archive work for this project, I really thought I'd be hard-pressed to find very much information. And what really blew me away, and I was really lucky to be at Itati. I had a year, so I went to the archives relatively frequently, was just how many foreign individuals I came across in the archives. Just the sheer quantity of particularly it was hard to find people about whom there was lots of information, but instead what I found was lots of references to lots of individuals, even though not very much was said about them. Just in terms of the enslaved Black retainers that I found mentions of in the, it is literally hundreds of people that I saw. And I really only looked at 17th century Florence. And it kind of blew me away that in this one very restricted location, I was just coming across so many different references. So I do think it's true that the number throughout Italy was small, but I think that the number in places of extreme wealth was actually really high. So I don't think those numbers were very well dispersed throughout the Italian peninsula. I think instead that at places like the court, particularly the Medici court, or some of, Kate Lowe's done a lot of work on Mantua, a century previous to this, and she found kind of similar numbers of individuals at the time. So the second question, also kind of on the topic of Kate Lowe, that I wanted to say something in response to was Kate Lowe's really provocative suggestion that lots of enslaved Africans in particular worked at trades that they had some experience with before they kind of became enslaved and were trafficked across the ocean. And I did find some instances of the gondolier who was kept by the Medici is repeatedly described as Moro and then gets battezzato, so presumably was a foreigner. The term Moro in Florence seems to almost exclusively refer to African individuals, Black Africans. But there were many Turcos and Moros that get trained up into music. The ones I found at the Florentine court mostly seem to be really young boys who get kind of chosen for their physical beauty or their their, I guess, docility to a certain degree. What is it that stands out that this young boy gets taken to be a court slave and another one gets sent to row on the oars? But they were often kind of trained up from a young age into music. So I don't know whether those individuals would even have had enough of a kind of cultural knowledge to bring some kind of musical techniques from their own kind of home culture in order to bring something to it. But there's such a huge tradition of Black drummers and Black trumpeters in Europe. Arne Spohr wrote a recent article in Jams on Black musicians in Germany, and in the period he was looking at, which was a period of about 100 years, there were over 300 individuals at courts who could be named and identified as Black, and more than half of them were either trumpeters, drummers, or fife players, many in the army. So there's this sort of direct shepherding of people towards those particular jobs and traits. And I do think it is very possible that there was a kind of shared repertoire, even among what the quote unquote Italian musicians or German musicians were playing in those parts, that because there was such a huge influence. One of the things that I talk about in my book, and I was really helped by Francesca Fantapie, was in the archive one day and she sent me a WhatsApp and she was like, is this useful? I just found this document about these enslaved trumpeters. And it was for the performance in 1608 where they had the fake naval battle, where they had the Turks versus the Christians. They shipped in all of these enslaved oarsmen to row the boats in that situation. And there was a letter saying, I've sent 32 enslaved trumpeters. That's the largest number I could find to play as part of this performance. So in that performance, it was not just, Italian musicians or trumpeters who were dressed up playing the trumpets as part of it. They actually got their enslaved, seafaring galley slaves who played the trumpet and had them producing that sound at the time to give it authenticity. So our ideas of how authentic is this sound, I think we need to take the possibility that there's some authentic other sound happening in those places really closely. There certainly was an ensemble in Livorno called the Musica Turchesca that is mentioned in the archives throughout the century. When the Medici would go to Livorno to observe their enslaved laborers there, they would often be entertained by the Musica Turchesca and tip them. Sometimes the ensemble was as many as 18 or 21 musicians, and they were kind of tipped for their musical performances. So I see that there are some questions, but I haven't read them. Shall we? Yeah,
so we might want to, thank you, Emily. I will just go through some of, so we have some comments. Well, Victoria Fanti thanking for this thought-provoking material. Suzanne Wofford, she's saying that these papers were really great, and she's teaching a course that overlaps significantly with this material in literature, and this was very instructive. And then we have, I think it's three two questions. One from Eric Nicholson. Hi, Eric. I think, Emily, you should be able to read the question, right? But I can read it aloud for everybody. Thank you for your wonderful talk and for accentuating such matters as all'usanza dei paesi loro. You showed us how this tag applied to musical styles, but have you found descriptions of dance, of movements, gestures, etc., that use these terms, perhaps in tandem with drumming and other percussion music?
No, I haven't. Though I have seen enslaved musicians at the Medici court who get explicitly trained in dance and in fencing. Those two things seem to go together. So I haven't found any that explicitly talk about dance. So,
right. Well, if things come up, we will let Eric know. Then there's a question. There's a question from Federica Parodi. Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. Could you say a little more about the concept of race in the early modern period vis-a-vis the modern notion of race? And I guess this is a question which you both might have things to say about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Janie has a lot to say about it too. And it's one that has been very contested. Some people have argued that it's completely anachronistic to use the term. In my book, the way I have been thinking about it as kind of a foundation for this project in general, I've really focused on the actual usages of the term razza in Italian discourse from the time. And it's used in, I think it's Kate Lowe that says this really explicitly, to mean lineage. And so therefore isn't race as we would think of it today. It means instead lineage. But one of the things that I'm kind of arguing is that lineage at that point was understood to encompass your class, your intelligence, like you came from a race of kings or a race of thieves, it predisposed you to inherited personality characteristics that would shape your life above and beyond whatever you might do with it. Like the idea of upward social mobility was a very limited one in early modern culture in general. Most people were kind of born into a category and stayed in that particular category. So the way that I'm seeing race, I don't think the differences are purely kind of ethno-linguistic. I write in the book quite a lot about a particular enslaved Black opera singer from the second half of the century. His name is Giovanni Bonacorsi, and he is described in his death certificate as Giovanni Bonacorsi, Moro Turco Battezzato. So even though he's Christian, he's being buried in the church with the sacraments. There are like 12 officials at the burial ceremony. He's still called out as being Black and as being a baptized infidel. So like he also spoke perfect Italian. We have a poem that he left that's like, it makes this like beautiful distinction between when he's using the subjunctive and when he's not. And mocks really cleverly all these other characters at the court, dwarves and other enslaved individuals. And so I think, I couldn't find any information about when he actually arrived, but I think he must have arrived in Italy at a very young age and became linguistically very fluent. Maybe he was even born in Italy, but he's not considered Italian. He is like throughout his life marked as this other who is there doing various things, but not himself Italian. And the fact that he remains marked by this difference even after conversion, even on his deathbed, even speaking Italian so well, I think speaks to the fact that there is some concept of a difference that's like embedded into a person and embedded into the category that they are, which for me, the term we would use is race. And that term did exist. You see them talking about the Black race or the white race. They also say like my race, meaning like my family line, my lineage. So I see it more as like the idea that a peasant might actually be able to lead a country would have been completely foreign. In all the opera libretti, it's because he's actually the babies have been switched at birth, but like the noble characteristics inhere into the body of that child, even as it grows out in a field, unkempt, uneducated. So for me, it's less that we've now got this modern idea of race. It's that we have expanded through the Enlightenment and through universal education, the idea of who can kind of aspire to the category of like nobility or of the male, the citizen, which always used to be this like white male noble category. We've expanded that category, but stopped short in terms of like saying, oh, well, no, just the white race. So we've sort of expanded the lineage and said that like, if you work hard, if you have enough money, if you cultivate your body, if you go to the gym and you exercise and you go to university and you learn a foreign language and you listen to classical music, you too can be president of the United States. But it's more that we have flattened razza into race rather than race not existing. But that I think like class in the early modern period, this is such a simplistic version of it, but class had more of the kind of consistency of what we think of as race today, as like limiting people's options and shaping the access that they would have had to nutrition and places to live and all sorts of things like that. But maybe Janie has a totally different take. I don't know.
No, I think that's a really interesting, a perception of it. And I would strongly recommend anybody to go also to the RSA website. Has a really, really rich bibliography for critical race studies in the early modern period, which is constantly being updated. But I very much see, this concept of race in terms of lineage, class, but also very much linked to racism and concepts of European whiteness and civilization. And this whole sort of, at the moment, I'm sort of very much immersed in these travel accounts of of Africa, of Ethiopia, of the Indian Ocean world by Europeans, and they're very much laced with these, already by this period of this idea of superiority and better, and it's razza in terms of white and lineage, but it's also superiority and a betterness in that we are civilized, whereas all'usanza loro, their indigenous practices, customs are primal, unsophisticated, basic. There's that derogatory underlying that goes with it, and I think that's very much that those ideas are intertwined in that concept of race from the outset. When you start looking at the sort of development of the concept of race in that early modern period.
Right. Thank you, Janie and Emily. We have 3, I think, final questions. Let's see if we manage to address them.
Full speed.
The first one is, I think, in the line of what we were just sort of saying from Nathan Reeves. Thanks very much for the talks. I have a question, perhaps for both speakers, about the way you are viewing these scenes as at least partially ethnographic. Is it possible to read all'usanza loro as being a statement as much about human musical sameness as about difference? And how do you understand this recognition of humanity, especially as it relates to the condition of slavery itself?
Thanks, Nathan. I mean, that's a great question. Ethnographic. I mean, I think one of the aspects of Mediterranean slavery that, and I know that you yourself have worked on this as well, that is really different from transatlantic slavery is the notion of its possible temporariness, and also its sort of like potential to happen to anyone, given the like vast numbers of individuals who ended up enslaved for temporary or permanent periods during this time period. So I do think that like with Mediterranean slavery, there was always the assumption that you too could become enslaved. Like even in 1604, there's like a account of like a Turkish, like an Ottoman ship, like arriving in Pisa and just like snatching whoever was like on the shore and pulling them onto the boat and like sailing off again. I also have seen accounts in, I think it's from 1684. There's like a travel account written in French where the author talks about like sitting around together with foreigners and playing parodies of each other's music, and the group finding this like hilarious. So there's this sense of like musical sound as being like very recognized, and the humanity of the other as being very recognized. There's also, I think, a big class element in that, like, like the Medici saw Facardin when he arrived as an ally, and as a kind of, they treated him with all of the same like decorum and rules that they would have treated like the head of state of a European country arriving on their doorstep unexpectedly. So there are ways in which like the sort of like, oh, I'm the sovereign, you're the sovereign, we can see each other, or seeing each other as other human beings definitely existed even through these categories. And I think that for me, like this interest in the all'usanza loro really came out of the fact that like I've done so much work where I don't have the music. Like I'm a musicologist. I've done so much work on the Commedia dell'arte and other performances where the music itself, for want of a better word, the score doesn't exist. So you have to do so much other searching to try and get at what these sound like. And when I was like reading this description of the performance, this line like really leapt out at me, and I was like, what does that mean? Like, what does that sound like? That they're creating a sound that doesn't sound European. So they're like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question at all, Nathan.
Janie, do you wish to pitch in? You're muted.
I was just going to add that I very much agree with what Emily was saying about this idea of equality as well with foreigners coming in of a certain stature. So there are examples of Ethiopian embassies coming into Rome and meeting with local nobility and very much being seen as equals, treated as equals, and not in that derogatory sense that we were referring to earlier. But I do also wonder if there's a sense of when it's all'usanza loro in a foreign context, maybe it has a different meaning as opposed to the term being used when it's on European soil.
So we will have to have another actually rendezvous to talk about this all'usanza loro, which has been a hit in Emily's paper. Okay, we have, let's see, Kate Driscoll's question. Grazie, Emily, for your wonderful presentation. And thank you, Janie, for sharing such thoughtful remarks. My question goes back to your notion, Emily, of sonic sociability, a term I really enjoy, and the entertaining quality of the guerra performance and its pouring out into public streets. Can you say more about the audience's role in these really interesting episodes of knowledge transfer and how the transmission of cultural difference is consumed differently depending on where performances take place?
Thanks, Kate. That is a really great question that I think I might answer in kind of two directions. One, in that, like, in the world of sonic sociability, the idea is that, like, the sound is telling the people so much about what is going on. And it really comes from my work in the Commedia dell'arte, where, like, people might not have necessarily understood the words that a certain character was saying if they were speaking in a really thick dialect, but they still would understand what was being said or how the interaction was unfolding just based on the rhythms or the pitch or the intonation of the speech, and how that gets really carried over into operatic music. But in opera, the kinds of music that you hear in the streets, the songs, the strophic forms, the, like, really kind of dance melodies and melodic stuff rather than the arioso or the, like, recitative lament or the soliloquy or whatever, those elements are provided precisely by the servant characters. And one of the things, like, there are so many, like, kind of like Black servant or Black slave characters in 17th century opera, particularly once you look at public opera. But I'm really interested in how this kind of natural musical simplicity and, like, a musical structure that suggests, like, a lot of redundancy and suggests this, like, happy, carefree nature gets really mapped onto first the lower classes and then kind of inhabited by these, like, enslaved Black figures. And I mean, I was really influenced by reading Hartman's Scenes of Subjection as I kind of began this project. And she talks about, like, the pastoral as a frame through which Blackness is understood as this, like, natural musicality that's just, like, kind of out there, that means that the kind of, like, overseer that's observing it doesn't have to worry about the suffering of the Black individuals who are enslaved, because they can't actually suffer. All they have is this, like, happy, bubbling, rhythmic, natural musicality that indicates to the listener that these people are so simple that they don't have fully evolved subjectivities. And you see exactly that happening in this operatic music, where this simple music gets repeatedly, the simple danceable music gets designated for the lower characters. And, like, florid singing or really impassioned, like Arianna's lament or whatever, is being sung by the serious characters, particularly in, like, from, like, 1600 to, like, 1650, that first, like, 50 years of the opera. There's this, like, really kind of huge divide. So I think that the arena and where the performances are happening is, like, that kind of recitative gets totally lost if you perform it out on the street. It really needs the inside, it needs the quiet, it needs the listening, all of these behaviors that then again reinforce this idea of what is natural for the populo and what is natural for the noble who is like in their house playing their lute and having a fine old time. So I think those spaces and the kinds of sounds that work in those spaces serve to kind of like reinforce this harmony. And I know we're probably out of time, but one thing that I did find out that I haven't done any work on, but I'd really like to do a lot of work on, is that the really big festival operas that the Medici put on in like Ercole in Tebe, and these other big ones that were put on for like big state events in like the 1650s, like 1658, 1659, had these huge choruses that were taken from the street. They were like, you know, the lists of like the people they gave the costumes to and how they're getting them back, of these people that were like, you know, the blacksmith and this person and how they all made all of these extras that were on stage. And so it's just kind of like astonishing to think, oh, hang on, all these people were actually sometimes there, but sometimes not there. So I haven't really thought through that yet, but
Right. Okay, let me just read the last two questions together so that we can then get to, because we are really sort of running out of time. I mean, this is fantastic, but I also don't want to keep you too long. Well, first of all, I just wanted to acknowledge that Leah Markey, who had to leave, said that she enjoyed the talk very, very much. And, you know, she will be in touch at some point because she wants to talk more through all these kind of things. So it's great to make connections even virtually. So we have an anonymous question, which is, how big of a role did enslaved Black African women play in music and the arts in Italy? Was there a large presence of, or mostly African men? That's one. And the other question from Julie Roberts, who's also thanking you both for the talks, is about the notion of Amerasia, right? When thinking about what appears to us to be the category confusion of India and America, have you considered, Rodowitz and Nagel, Amerasia, that these continents overlapped significantly in the European imagination until 1700?
Yeah, I mean, Alex Nagel was at Itati when I was there, and he gave, you know, we talked a lot, and he gave one really great presentation with all these maps that just showed how they thought they were like joined up. And yeah, his work has definitely influenced my way of thinking about it. So yes, is the answer to that. To the other question, I have found mention of lots of Black women, fewer Black women than Black men, but I did not find any that were actively involved in music making that I could document or trace. So I've found them described in poems, and I've seen like their names or getting tipped for various things, but I didn't see. One was boxing, a sort of fight. Yeah, but
right.
No direct. No, I was very sad not to find that, but maybe somebody else will.
Well, that's when the archives reopen, hopefully. So I think we have a very last, I mean, I will take it as a comment, which is actually for both of you from Giulia Acornero. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk and response. I have a question for both. Can we conflate or map onto each other categories such as foreignness, otherness, or difference with racial difference? Thank you.
I mean, do you want to answer that, Janie? I've done a lot of talking. Oh, you're muted.
I'm muted.
Hi, sorry, what was the question again? I'm not clear about what the question is.
So the last one is, can we conflate or map onto each other categories such as foreignness, otherness, or difference with racial difference?
So the question is, do we take the race out of difference, I suppose?
Yes, or how to handle these sort of partly overlapping kind of notions, right? I mean, I guess this kind of goes a little bit back to what we were saying earlier.
So is foreignness the same as otherness, right? Is difference the same?
I mean, it's very difficult to know what Seicento concepts of foreignness, otherness, difference was in that period, and how these then get actually expressed in musical works and in sound. I suspect that the whole sort of idea of racial difference perhaps comes as a later thought, not necessarily a contemporary one. But notions of foreignness, otherness, racism already are circulating in that period. So I would put the two together probably already. What do you think, Emily?
I mean, I'm teaching a class, this is a seminar at the Grad Center on early modern voice. And one of the things we were like trying to get to the, like, so like Orlando di Lasso's like Matona Mia Cara that mocks this like beer swilling, sausage eating German, right? Is that racism or is that just good fun? And
stereotype.
Exactly. And is stereotype racism? And then we read about that the same week that we were reading Don Haran's article on like stereotypes of Jewish individuals in part songs. So it's like, well, is it more or less problematic to stereotype German mispronunciation of Italian than it is to mark Jewish mispronunciation of Italian? Like, are they equally offensive? Is one more offensive than the other? Is it more offensive, the Jewishness, because the Jew is policed in a way that like Germans weren't necessarily, but at the same time, I think it's a really tricky set of questions that gets really conflated with our own like contemporary ideas of like what the hierarchy is amongst people. And there's definitely an understanding of difference. There's definitely an understanding of foreign difference. And there's definitely racisms that mock other Europeans, but allow mostly them into the fold in a way that like is different, I think, from the way that enslaved foreigners are brought into the fold. So that, in modern terms, we would call it racism. So they didn't have the term for racism, but they also didn't have the term for, I don't know, same-sex marriage. Doesn't mean people weren't like, you know, there's Corelli and his violinist friend. They lived together for 32 years or something, right? Like, I don't know, like just because they didn't have a name for it didn't mean that it didn't exist. So.
Right. On that note,
and
I'm afraid. Yes, please, Jenny.
No, I was just going to add that perhaps it's a question of also different stratas of society. So, you know, enslavement would be perhaps racial difference and, you know, racism attached because it's this lower. But looking at musicians, Matteo Giovanni, who's accepted into the court.
You're muted again.
You're muted.
Someone like Matteo Giovanni, who becomes part of the court culture and part of that knowledge transfer, and who's accepted, is treated completely differently. He's treated as a foreigner, but there's not necessarily a racial difference with a sort of derogatory sense to it. So, yeah, perhaps it's a question also of social position in that sense.
Yeah, class, social position. Yeah,
class.
That's a complicated question.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Emily Wilburn and Janie Cole, for being with us today for, you know, this generous discussion. Thank you for all the great questions which we got from the attendees. It's really nice to get together in these occasions. So we will have another event in the Viva Voce series entitled "Domesticating the Moose, Myths of Female Voice and Enlightened Progress in 1790s Italy, which is a talk by musicologist Jessica Peritz from Yale, with a response by classicist Shane Butler from Johns Hopkins University, and this will be April the 8th. So thank you so much, everybody, and looking forward to seeing you at some point in the future in person. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.